Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. On July 11th, the global Ismaili community commemorates Imamat Day, the day when Maulana Hazrat Imam became the 49th Imam. It is a day of celebration and of reflection. And today I'm honored to be joined by Professor Azim Nanji to talk about the Ismaili Imamat in history. If you're not already familiar with Professor Nanji, he currently serves on the Board of Trustees of the Aga Khan University, United Kingdom, as well as the board of the Global Center for Pluralism. At the end of his academic career, he served as the Senior Associate Director of the Abbasi Program of Islamic Studies at Stanford University. And many of you will remember him as director of the Institute of Ismaili Studies for many years. He's also written numerous books and articles on the topic of Islam, and particularly his passion about the Ginans as well. We're here, Professor Nanji, in this beautiful Aga Khan Museum, surrounded by reminders of Muslim history. You know, as we start this conversation about the Imamat in history, maybe you can talk a little bit about the role of the Imam throughout this history.
I think you want to position the Imam in the context of how authority occurred within the Muslim tradition, but also retrospectively within the traditions that had come before, like Judaism, Christianity, and so on. So it's a continuum on the historical framework that Ismaili thinkers developed, where they wanted to see history as something that emerged out of the past as a way of relating God to humanity. In that context, the specific notion of the Imamat develops in Ismaili history right from the beginning of Islam, because the Prophet held authority in the community, in the Ummah, in both spiritual and material matters, and the guidance that he received from God, which is recorded, as we know, in the Quran, was enabled the Muslim community to build both a structure of belonging to a faith, but also belonging to a community. And then after the Prophet passed away, the notion of guidance continued. The notion of how the community would continue to be connected to its sources, but also move forward in the context of new ways of adapting and interpreting how those sources would guide their lives in the future. And as we know, the Muslim world expanded greatly, so there was a great deal of diversity, both regionally, geographically, ethnically, and so on. So guidance became necessary as a way of ensuring that the message of the Quran continued, the example of the Prophet was interpreted in a way that enabled the Imam to contextualize the faith in different conditions among different and diverse communities. Now, historically, the Shia tradition holds that the Prophet Muhammad designated his son-in-law and cousin, Maulana Ali, to be the first Imam. And that declaration was made during his farewell pilgrimage at a place called Ghadir Khum. And at Ghadir Khum, he made that very famous statement that lives and echoes not only in history, but in literature, music, etc. Man kuntu maulahu, aliyun maulahu. He was Lord, Mawla, I am, Ali is his Mawla. And I think part of the way that relationship develops and is built into the community is really the story of the Imamat in history.
I mean, so many wonderful themes come from that, Professor Nanji. You've got this first kind of broader context of guidance in societies as well. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit to the diversity of how leadership is within the Muslim communities, in addition to the Ismaili community.
So all Muslim scholars who wrote about leadership, different diverse groups, Sunni, Shia, Zaydi, etc., they all affirmed the necessity of leadership and articulated what is a notion of imamat in their own context. So in their works, they use the same words. But for example, there is a famous work by a Sunni writer called Al-Mawardi, called Ahkam al-Sultaniya, that is the governance of the state. And he uses the word Sultaniya because at that time, the word for authority within some Sunni communities had become the word sultan, which was a further development from the original idea that had developed. So what we have is a notion that's common to all Muslim groups. The difference is that that role within most communities has become restricted to primarily the development of a juristic and theological tradition. So that authority is constrained by the way in which the Sharia is elaborated within those communities, and the authority develops the way in which it operates based on those principles. Now, that always didn't occur in history, of course. You know, a lot of these rulers acquired their authority through war or through the exercise of power. But what's interesting, I think, within the Shia tradition is that that authority was not necessarily tied to having political authority. It was always authority where the position of the imam, the role of the imam to guide the community, depending on the times, was independent of whether they were in political authority or not. So we know, for example, in Ismaili history, that there were times like the Fatimid period or in the Nizari period in Alamut, where there was authority over a territory and a state, and that was exercised by the imams of the time. But otherwise, the role of the imam, particularly in the Shi'i context and in its Ismaili interpretation, is not necessarily tied to having political authority. And what's important about that is it doesn't involve any territorial control. In other words, the imam is the imam of all the followers, regardless of where they live. And that kind of transnational, global way of exercising the imamat is something that happened historically. Of course, we see it much more evident today, but historically, you know, the Fatimid imams or other imams were able to exercise authority and give guidance to communities which they could reach, you know, either through a da'i, an intermediary, or directly. So that's, I think, important that that institution has remained in history to provide guidance as in a living form, in a present form, rather than be conceived as a concept or be conceived in ways that other communities have developed, like the Ithna Ashari or the Bohra community, where the imam is believed to be present but absent from the world.
Professor Naji, you've talked a lot about authority and guidance, and there's this political authority, legal authority, but that the Imam's authority sits apart from some of that as well, or can sit together with it. Let's talk a little bit more about what is the Imam's authority. When we talk about the authority of the Imamat, what does that encompass for believers?
Mostly, I think we have to think in terms of the Imamat as being a way to guide followers in their spiritual lives. But the Imam is also responsible for ensuring that the community's material conditions, its quality of life, its security, are also things that the Imam cares about, gives attention to. So we cannot divorce those considerations from purely what we might call religious considerations. I think there's an intertwining of that authority in material context, but also in spiritual context. And I think that's critical to the way in which the Imam's role develops in history. Because there are times when the Imam's guidance can affect material lives, right, in many different ways. And that role becomes important because in Ismaili thought, matter is that which is fused with spirit. Matter is the prop for the spirit. So faith has to be created in the world. It's not independent of the world. It's not a faith of retreat. And what I find fascinating about the Imamat is that the notion of authority took responsibility for the material conditions of the followers as well, rather than simply exercising a spiritual authority that was divorced from material life. And that engagement is, of course, something we see in the life of the Prophet, that he didn't separate these domains of life. He engaged in both, and he engaged actively in both. And I think maybe historically we can differentiate Islam from other religious traditions. Probably, I would say, some Christian interpretations, certainly Hindu and Buddhist interpretations, where the world is a place that's tainted. I think a lot of it in the Christian tradition goes back to St. Augustine, who developed this notion of the city of God and the city of man, where spirituality, purity, salvation rests in that city of God, not in the city of man. But I think in the Islamic tradition, and given the particular context of authority of the Imam in Ismailism, that divorce of the realms is not there. It's something that allows Islam to address the conditions of the world. It doesn't retreat from the world. And that's, for me, that's a fascinating differentiation because it brings into the picture the vital role of social justice. That without social justice, the conditions in which human beings live cannot be addressed. And that idea of social justice springs, as in the case of Islam, and people would argue in other religious traditions, from the basic foundations of the faith. So that ethical and moral perspective is what gives the Imam's authority an engagement that's much wider and embraces issues that sometimes people think don't belong to religion.
One of the central elements of the Islamic faith is the inseparable nature of faith and world. The two are so deeply intertwined that one cannot imagine this separation or their separation. They constitute for us a way of life. The role and responsibility of an imam, therefore, is both to interpret the faith to the community and also to do all within his means to improve the quality and security of their daily lives. I am fascinated and sometimes frustrated when representatives of the Western world, especially the Western media, try to describe the work of our Aga Khan Development Network in fields like education, health, the economy, media, and the building of social infrastructure, reflecting a certain historical tendency of the West to separate the secular from the religious. They often describe it either as philanthropy or entrepreneurship. What is not understood is that this work is for us a part of our institutional responsibility. It flows from the mandate of the office of the Imam to improve the quality of worldly life for the concerned communities.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about social justice. You talked about roots in the time of the Prophet. And now, what are some of the themes that how have imams integrated that into their guidance?
Let's look at it from the point of view of where the Ismaili community lives. So primarily, it has lived in parts of the world that today would be regarded in some cases as being poor, sort of low-income countries. And therefore, the question of inequality became critical. And that's true also within the Ismaili community today, because you have members of the community living in countries that are going through difficult times or have a history of economic inequality. So it becomes important not to treat the role of the imam as someone who simply offers charity to redress poverty. The role becomes much more comprehensive. How do you enable each individual to grow, to take responsibility for their own condition? So it's not about a quick fix. It's a process that enables people to develop the capacity to improve their own quality of life. So that's one piece. The other is that within the Muslim world largely, and I would say the developing world in general, there has been a great deal of marginalization of women. One could argue that that's true in the West as well, because we've had a lot of movement to redress the balance of discrimination against women. Now, if women have been marginalized in history, how do you address that condition so that women can play a much more active role in the public sphere of life? They've always been fundamental in the survival of society, and we undervalue the historical role that women have played in keeping family together, community together, and providing an anchor to social life and particularly to identity. But in public life and in opportunities which enable women to play a much more activist role in the economic life of nations and communities, that's where women have faced marginalization. So the key to that, and we go back to Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah, was to redress it by enabling women to move into the public sphere through tools such as education, and also to qualify themselves to function in a world in which their role was not one that was restricted to domestic space, but also influenced and contributed to public space. So you see that movement over the last 150 years gradually bringing, particularly Ismaili women, more and more into the domain of public life and public activity, and of contributing to national and community development. And I think similarly we see in places where there is immense poverty and opportunity through education, through programs, to enable not only the community, but all those amongst whom the community lives, to improve the conditions of that life. So the role, I think, if you think about it, is of the Imam is not restricted to the community itself. The Imamat, where it has been possible, sees itself as an agent of bringing about social change and development across the world. And I think when you think of how the way in which authority is exercised, you see a return, I think, of some of the foundational principles within Islam and in the life of the Prophet that are missed because people tend to concentrate on the ritual or theological expressions of faith. And I think that balance is important to recognize, that the ethical and moral purposes within Islam were critical. So, just to give you one example, one of the most important challenges human beings face is their health and well-being, physical, mental. Right? Now, when you look at the availability of healthcare in some of the countries of the world, it is minimal. So I think when you think of healthcare, it appears as a secular need, but it's fundamental to all the things that human beings do. And more now we speak about mental health, particularly after the pandemic. And mental health is a component of one's inner life. And inner life is very much intertwined with one's commitments to spirituality, to intellectual growth, and to the role that one sees for oneself in a world. So I think you're getting some of these issues emerging as moral questions for our time that are universal and are also rooted in the concern that Islam had from its very early period for things like medicine, healthcare, the building of hospitals, and ensuring that particularly the marginalized were provided free care. So those are important components to how, at least, I perceive authority being exercised in the context of that fusion.
Professor Nanji, this term imam is used in various Muslim communities. How is it distinctive, or what makes its usage distinctive in the Ismaili community?
Well, besides its grounding in notions of spiritual authority that are rooted in the Quran and in the Prophet's own designation of a successor to continue to guide the community and provide that continuity of faith. I think what is distinctive is that the line has continued among the descendants of the Prophet continuously now for over 1400 years. And that distinctiveness gives it legitimacy because the Imam is always present. He may not be seen by the entire community because the community lives in different parts of the world. But historically, the Imams were available to the Jamaat and the followers for guidance because there was a structure that supported the Imamat in terms of being a link between the Imam and the community. Now, historically, the institution of the da'wah was a very important part of how this was done, because the dais were not only sort of tremendous intellectuals in many cases, but very versatile in administrative responsibilities. So they were able to be teachers, they were also able to be good communicators in whatever language was there for the Jamaat. So we think of Nasir Khosrow, one of the great poets, philosophers of the tradition. Now, he deliberately chose to write in Persian, even though the context of the time had made Arabic the primary language of communication. And of course, he not only created a legacy for the Ismaili community, but a legacy for the Persian-speaking world. And he is regarded as one of the major influences in the development of Persian literature. And as you know, we went through a period of almost 500 to 600 years after Alamut, when the Ismailis moved into what I guess we could regard as their silent, quiet phase, where faith lived and was kept alive through the local traditions that they had developed. So you see this kind of encompassing way in which the history of the Imamat and the teachings and the guidance permeates times in which there is very little access to the Imam. And that part, I think, of our history is something for which we don't have much documentation. But the fact that these communities survived, lived, and thrived religiously, I think is very important to recognize.
Historically, Ismailis are united by a common allegiance to the living hereditary Imam of the time, in the progeny of Islam's last and final prophet, Muhammad, may peace be upon him, through his daughter Fatima and her husband, Hazrat Ali, the Prophet's cousin and the first Shia Imam. In the Muslim ethical tradition which links spirit and matter, the Imam not only leads in the interpretation of the faith, but also in the effort to improve the quality of life of his community and of the wider societies within which it lives. For a guiding principle of the Imamat's institutions is to replace walls which divide with bridges that unite.
You've walked us through so beautifully, Professor Nanji, kind of our history and how the Imam has really adjusted according to the time, and the community has as well, in terms of how faith has been practiced and interpreted and taught. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the relationship between a murid and the Imam that in some ways we talk about as transcending some of these differences and kind of being maybe a little bit more universal throughout history. Let's talk a little bit more about that, if we may.
So that there's a principle developed within the Shia tradition and also in the Ismaili tradition. Qadi al-Nu'man's great work, Daim al-Islam, makes walaya a pillar of Islam. Now, the concept of walaya is not just one of authority. It's one of a perspective of devotion and a personal relationship with the Imam. So walaya involves being devoted to the Imam. It's not just an acceptance of his authority, as it would be in some other traditions. And that kind of devotion is fostered through the interactive relationship that exists between the Imam and the murid. And it's a spiritual relationship. It's a relationship of commitment. It's a relationship of love. It's a relationship of exchange. And that exchange takes place primarily in the heart of the murid. It doesn't necessarily take place in a relationship which is visible. And I think that has always been an important part of the esoteric component of Islam. And because the link is spiritual, the physical presence of the Imam is not necessary. So the Imam is Hazir Imam, both in the sense that he is in the world, but also in the hearts of murids. And that, of course, there's a lot of poetry, both among the Ginans, but also in Persian and Arabic, that you could go on having a mushaira forever. But I think those are important and critical aspects of that personal relationship between the Imam and the murid.
The famous verse of light in the Quran, the Ayat an-Nur, whose first line is rendered here in the mural behind me, inspires among Muslims a reflection on the sacred, the transcendent. It hints at a cosmos full of signs and symbols that evoke the perfection of Allah's creation and mercy.
Professor Naji, you've talked so beautifully about this esoteric relationship. I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about light and how that relates to the Imamat.
This notion that light is inherent in the act of creation itself is then picked up, particularly within the Shia and Sufi tradition, as an idea that makes light related to both the Prophet and the Imams. So there is this concept of Nur-e-Muhammadi, that light is associated with the Prophet since the time of creation. And it was when God created the world, He also created that light. And that light is manifested through the Prophet, and then after the Prophet through the Imams. So this notion of Nur, we have the idea again in the Quran of Nurun Mubin, right? A light that is manifest. So that becomes an important part of the way in which the Shia and the Ismaili tradition conceive the role of the Imam. That it is this light that enables not only the relationship between the individual who wishes to access that light, but also the way in which that light creates knowledge for the community and the followers and illuminates its way, both spiritually and materially.
With this vision, this guidance that Hazrat Imam is giving, and we look at the world today and some of the pressing issues we have in our world, when we look at the environment, for example, how do you see kind of the Imam putting seeds of guidance for us in how to navigate some of these complex issues of our world, but very steeped also in the tradition and in our faith?
So, there is a verse in the Quran that asks human beings to tread lightly on the earth, right? It's a custodial role. A human being is called a Khalifa, somebody who has responsibility. And Hazrat Imam often mentions that, one of the purposes of Islam is that we should leave the world better than how we found it. And I think the environment is very critical to that, because all of the things that we have done to it, you can catalog over the last 50 to 100 years, have created a crisis, an environmental crisis, which is linked to a climate crisis. So we're in the midst of looking at how the shape of our lives can address this. And while there's a lot of debate, contentious debate about fossil fuels and so on, what's important is that we should develop the institutional mechanisms that can foresee and forestall the effects of climate change on our environment and on ourselves. And the AKDN is a dynamic institution, right? it doesn't remain still. So within the AKDN now, there is a unit that addresses this very question. And the way it impacts institutionally across the AKDN and Jamati institutions globally, that it seeks solutions for issues such as how you should build, how you should use alternative forms of energy to provide for the needs, your needs for power, for energy, and not be dependent on those sources that can be destructive.
If we continue on the institutional lens for a moment, you've talked about two things that I think are really interesting about the AKDN. One is that it's very connected to the role of the Imam itself, that this is a way in which the present Imam is really exercising his roles and responsibilities as Imam. So it's not divorced from his role as Imam when we look at the work of the AKDN. But also when you talk about the scope, when people think about development or working in the world, the kinds of things that the AKDN is doing is so broad. I'd love for you to tell us more about this notion of what quality of life is and how the Imam has really expanded the view of what we need to engage with in the world in order to really focus on improving quality of life in such a more nuanced, broad way than I think we've seen others interpret it.
So one of the biggest challenges we face as individuals living in this planet is conflict. I mean, we have a conflict currently going on in the Middle East, we have a conflict going on in Europe, and we have conflicts going on in different parts of the world. I woke up this morning and heard that there was an attempted coup in Bolivia. Now, if we are unable to resolve the issues that divide us, then there's not much hope that we can have better futures, because futures depend on the idea of peace. And they depend on our ability to function in a world that has stability and the absence of war. Now, one of the examples at a global level is the creation of the Global Center for Pluralism, right? So the idea that pluralism is both an intellectual and moral tool about how we think of the world, but also a practice, something we actually live out in our lives, is very important to the mission of the Global Center for Pluralism, not just in Canada, but across the world. So if you look at the activities of the Global Center for Pluralism, it tries to profile best practices in pluralism through its award to various individuals, communities, and countries who have developed best practice and who actually practice it in many different ways in their own contexts. Now, I think if we cannot solve the issue of how we get along with each other, in spite of our differences, then I think we are going to have a very difficult future. So pluralism as a value does not diminish the idea of differences. It sees differences as ways in which you enable people coming from different backgrounds and different commitments to dialogue with each other, to bring ideas on the table that create a common platform. Because if you don't start from a common platform, then your differences enter into contentious strife at the most basic level. And I think that is one of the contributions that AKDN, through its partnership with the Government of Canada, is trying to make through the Global Center for Pluralism.
We've started this conversation reflecting on Imamat Day and kind of thinking about July 11th and when Maulana Hazri Imam became the 49th Imam. But through our conversation, though, we've talked about Imamat throughout history and how it's part of this much larger tradition than just this one day. We've talked about the role of the Imam in a murid's life. And I wonder, as we bring this conversation to a close, Professor Ananji, what might you encourage murids to think about on this Imamat Day? What might you encourage us to do as we commemorate and reflect on this day?
So my fondest memories are of biryani and sharbat, right? But those were simply ways in which the community came together.
Yes.
So it's this gathering of the community to celebrate, to commemorate, but also to remember, because it allows one to reaffirm one's allegiance to a leader, an imam, who has played such an important role in your life, individually, but also for the community. And I think that brings together now, of course, more than ever, at a global level, the entire community of Ismailis who celebrate this on the same day and are part of the same history, and also see themselves as trustees of what they have learned and what they can contribute. And I think part of the way in which it's worth thinking about Imamat Day is to say, we have become trustees of the history of what this institution has given, offered to the world. And what is it that as trustees we can do to enable others to benefit from the more universal messages and lessons that have come? So that gives us a responsibility both at a personal level, but I think also in the various societies in which we live. And I think probably nothing would make the Imam of the time happier than to see the members of the Jamaat not only coming together as a united community, but also as one that has taken to heart this purpose, social, ethical, and moral purpose of leaving the world a better place than we find it.
What a beautiful way to commemorate this special day, Professor Nanji. Really appreciate your time in sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you so much for this conversation.
As you know, I am ambitious for my Jamaat. I'm ambitious for my Jamaat worldwide. Wherever a murid is living, he or she is an immediate concern to the Imam of the time. This has been my life since 1957, and it will continue to be my life.